Welcome to this deep dive into Deleuze and Guattari's Capitalism and Schizophrenia project.
Okay.
We'll be focusing specifically on the 2 volumes, Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus.
All right.
2 volumes that completely reimagine desire, not just psychologically,
Right.
but as a force shaping reality itself.
It's crucial to understand that for Deleuze and Guattari, desire isn't about lack or wanting something you don't have.
Okay.
It's a productive force they call desiring production, actively connecting us to the world.
I'm very intrigued by how they use this idea of desiring production to challenge traditional psychoanalysis. Plus, it's the Oedipus complex.
Right.
So like they're saying the Oedipal model is a way to control desire,
Yes.
limiting its potential.
Absolutely. Anti-Oedipus directly argues that the Oedipus complex is a tool of social repression forcing us to conform. It's not a natural stage of development, as traditional psychoanalysis suggests.
To fully grasp this critique, I think we need to understand their concept of desiring machines.
Okay.
This is where I often struggle. Can you break it down for me and our listener?
They use desiring machines metaphorically to explain how desire breaks, and reconnects with different parts of our reality. These machines are not physical objects, but conceptual tools.
Okay.
Imagine them as circuits constantly flowing and transforming, connecting us to the world.
So are they suggesting that if these desiring machines experience interruptions or what we might call glitches, this leads to what we label as mental health conditions like schizophrenia?
That's one way to look at it. Deleuze and Guattari argue that these glitches are inherent to the process of desiring production, and they're not something to be fixed.
Right.
These disruptions are part of what makes us who we are.
Okay.
Their method, schizoanalysis, isn't about fixing these glitches, but about understanding how they operate within societal structures.
Now, Anti-Oedipus came out in 1972.
Yes.
A time of immense upheaval,
Right.
particularly in France with the events of May '68 and the Algerian War. I imagine these events heavily influenced their thinking.
The historical context is crucial. Deleuze and Guattari saw these events as expressions of a desire for change, a rejection of oppressive structures.
Right.
Anti-Oedipus can be read as a philosophical response to these events, urging us to dismantle traditional thinking and embrace the revolutionary potential of desire.
That makes their critique of the Oedipus complex even more potent.
Yeah.
They're suggesting that this focus on the family keeps desire confined to a personal sphere, preventing it from spilling into the political realm.
Their critique goes deeper. They argue that familialism, that tendency to view everything through the family lens, fundamentally limits our understanding of desire and its relationship to society.
It seems like they're pushing us to recognize how societal systems reflect and reinforce our desires, often in ways that hinder our own liberation.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a call to examine our own inertia within these systems.
Anti-Oedipus sparked intense debate, and unfortunately, some critics misunderstood Deleuze and Guattari as rejecting Marxism in favor of Nietzsche.
But isn't it more accurate to say they use Nietzsche to complicate and enhance Marxist ideas?
Precisely.
They're interested in how desire, this powerful force, is both repressed and potentially liberated from Oedipal and capitalist structures.
They move beyond simply critiquing psychoanalysis, urging us to see how capitalism itself functions as a system that continuously captures and redirects desire, often towards production and consumption.
7 years later, they published 1,000 Plateaus, which expands on Anti-Oedipus. It's structured as a series of plateaus, each exploring different themes, but interconnected in a way that challenges traditional hierarchical knowledge.
This structure reflects their concept of the rhizome, a model of knowledge that resists linear progression.
Interesting.
They're arguing that thought itself can be fluid and interconnected, just like the rhizome's network of roots.
1,000 Plateaus also introduces the concept of assemblages, replacing traditional categories of things, subjects and objects. This seems to underline their view of the interconnectedness and fluidity of everything.
Assemblages are constantly in flux, characterized by 2 tendencies. Stratification, the tendency towards stability, and becoming, the tendency towards change. They use these concepts to analyze various social formations, offering a new way of looking at the world.
So it's not about fixed categories anymore. It's about understanding how things connect, change, and become something else entirely.
Exactly.
This challenges our typical ways of categorizing and understanding reality.
Precisely. They offer a powerful critique of traditional linguistics with their concept of order words, highlighting the performative and action-oriented nature of language.
Okay.
They challenge the idea that language is simply about conveying information.
Their analysis of the face is particularly fascinating.
Yes.
They describe faciality machines.
Right.
Which control how we present ourselves socially. This relates to their critique of how language shapes our perceptions and identities.
Faciality machines link the face to the dominance of the signifier and subjectification in contemporary society.
Interesting.
They're essentially saying that the face becomes a product of societal control, not a genuine expression of self.
This connects back to their overarching project.
Yes.
Of exploring how capitalism constantly deterritorializes and reterritorializes desire, channeling it towards production and consumption.
Deleuze and Guattari view capitalism as a system that thrives on capturing and redirecting the flows of desire.
Right.
Even the sexual revolution, they argue, becomes co-opted by capitalism to fuel its engine.
So how do we apply these insights? What can we do with this knowledge about desiring machines? Decoded flows and faciality machines.
That's where their concept of schizophrenia comes in.
Okay.
They use it not as a clinical diagnosis, but as a philosophical concept representing a potential escape route from capitalist control.
Interesting.
They suggest that understanding the workings of desiring machines is crucial for finding new ways of being and relating.
1,000 Plateaus introduces abstract machines to help us understand how assemblages change.
Right.
They aren't physical machines, but conceptual tools for analyzing the processes underlying assemblages and their potential for transformation.
Right. They're encouraging us to think about change not as a linear progression, but as a fluid process full of unexpected connections and transformations. They propose a molecular revolution where liberation comes not from a single grand event, but from numerous small localized shifts.
Okay, now let's delve into the concept of the war machine.
All right.
They differentiate it from the state apparatus, seeing it as nomadic and fluid, constantly resisting capture and control.
What's fascinating here is how they view the war machine not just as a tool of violence, but as a potential force for deterritorialization.
Interesting.
It disrupts fixed structures and creates new possibilities.
Okay.
They argue that the state, in its pursuit of order, continually attempts to subdue this war machine.
They use this concept to analyze historical examples, from nomadic tribes to guerrilla movements, showing how the war machine resists capture and maintains autonomy in the face of state power.
Yeah, they also differentiate between royal science and nomad science. They argue that royal science, tied to the state, aims to impose order and control, while nomad science is fluid, experimental, and open to chance.
Okay.
They use this distinction to analyze the development of knowledge and technology through history.
Okay.
They suggest that nomad science, with its emphasis on deterritorialization and becoming, offers a different way of thinking about knowledge and its relationship to power.
They see a connection between nomad science and the war machine.
Yes.
Arguing that both embodies a resistance to the state's desire for order. Understanding this connection, they suggest, can help us imagine alternative ways of knowing and being in the world.
Now, they frequently discuss smooth space and striated space and how these relate to the war machine and the state apparatus.
Right. Could you clarify these concepts further?
Smooth space is fluid, open, and unconfined, like the space of the nomad or the war machine. Striated space is fixed, ordered, and controlled, representing the space of the state and sedentary societies.
So are they arguing that the state continuously attempts to impose its order by striating smooth space?
Precisely. They use the example of how states build roads and walls to divide and control territory.
Okay.
They link this process of striation to the state's attempts to subdue the war machine, which thrives in the fluidity of smooth space.
Okay, now let's explore how capitalism relates to smooth and striated space.
What's intriguing here is how they see capitalism as both deterritorializing and reterritorializing.
Okay.
Initially, capitalism acts as a force of deterritorialization, breaking down feudal structures and opening up new markets.
But as capitalism evolves, it also creates new forms of striation.
Exactly. It develops new methods for controlling and channeling desire. They highlight how capitalism uses advertising and consumer culture to manufacture desires and needs, funneling them towards the consumption of commodities.
So while capitalism might seem liberating at first,
Yeah, it does.
it eventually creates new forms of control and exploitation,
Precisely.
mirroring the state's efforts to striate smooth space.
They're suggesting that capitalism, in its pursuit of profit, ultimately becomes a force for striating the world, mirroring the state's desire for order.
This raises crucial questions about the potential for true liberation within a capitalist system.
Absolutely.
Now let's delve deeper into the relationship between capitalism and schizophrenia,
a
concept they frequently discuss.
In Anti-Oedipus, they highlight how capitalism continually deterritorializes and reterritorializes desire, a process they see as central to its functioning. They link this to schizophrenia, which they view as a limited experience of capitalism.
Are they suggesting that schizophrenia represents a breakdown
Yes.
of the mechanisms that capitalism uses to channel and control desire?
Exactly. They see schizophrenia not as a traditional mental illness, but as a line of flight, a break from the dominant structures. It represents a complete deterritorialization of desire, a shattering of the codes that constrain it.
They analyze how capitalism constantly pushes individuals to adapt, embrace new desires, and participate in the cycle of production and consumption.
Yes.
Does this relate to their view of schizophrenia?
Absolutely.
As a limited experience of this system?
It's crucial to understand that they are not romanticizing schizophrenia. But they are interested in what it reveals about the limits of capitalist control. In its extreme form, they argue, it exposes capitalism's inherent contradictions and its reliance on constantly producing new desires and needs.
Their work is full of these challenging and unconventional interpretations. It's a very different way of looking at both individual and societal structures.
It really is. It makes you question everything you thought you knew.
Absolutely. It challenges us to think differently about the very foundations of our world.
Exactly. And that's the power of Deleuze and Guattari's work. It pushes us to see the world anew.
I think that's a perfect place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, exploring the core concepts of Anti-Oedipus and how it sets the stage for their broader project.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
Join us in the next part of this deep dive, where we'll continue to unpack the complexities of 1,000 Plateaus.
I'm looking forward to it.
And explore how Deleuze and Guattari's ideas challenge us to rethink the very fabric of reality.
It's going to be a wild ride.
And the potential for liberation in a world dominated by capitalist forces.
Definitely. So until next time, keep those desiring machines running.
And those lines of flight open.
Exactly. They're suggesting that understanding this connection between capitalism and schizophrenia can help us consider alternative ways of organizing society that allow for more freedom and creativity without falling into the traps of capitalist exploitation.
They also discuss how capitalism creates new forms of subjectivity, shaping how we experience the world and ourselves.
Right. They argue that capitalism, with its focus on individualism, competition, and profit, generates a fragmented, alienated subject always striving for more.
And they connect this to the rise of consumer culture, which constantly creates a sense of lack and dissatisfaction.
They're suggesting that capitalism produces subjects perpetually driven by desire, yet perpetually unable to satisfy it. This becomes a key mechanism of control, creating subjects forever chasing an unattainable fulfillment.
They also talk about capitalism's tendency towards deterritorialization, breaking down traditional boundaries and structures.
They see this as a key feature of capitalism, its ability to constantly expand cross borders and integrate new markets and populations into its system.
Examples like globalization, multinational corporations, and the interconnected global economy come to mind.
But while deterritorializing capitalism simultaneously creates new forms of reterritorialization, new ways of controlling and channeling desire, it's a dialectical process, a constant interplay between these forces.
So even as capitalism appears to liberate and expand, it also creates new forms of control and enclosure, mirroring the state's efforts to striate smooth space.
Now, in 1,000 Plateaus, they introduce the body without organs, which they see as a limit of the organism, a zone of pure potentiality.
They emphasize that the body without organs isn't a physical entity, but a conceptual space, a zone of undifferentiated potential outside the organized structures of the body.
And they see it as both dangerous and full of possibility. It's dangerous because it represents a breakdown of the organism, a loss of identity and coherence.
But it's also full of possibility because it signifies a break from the organism's constraints, opening up potential for new forms of becoming.
They link the body without organs to deterritorialization, arguing that deterritorialization is a movement towards it, a shedding of the organism's structures and constraints.
So they're suggesting that while dangerous, the body without organs holds the potential for new subjectivities, new ways of being and relating that break free from traditional categories and identities.
They use the body without organs to analyze the relationship between desire and capitalism, arguing that capitalism in its constant deterritorialization and reterritorialization of desire pushes individuals towards an encounter with the body without organs.
This encounter becomes a potentially destabilizing experience, a break from established structures.
But it's also a potential site of resistance, a space for imagining and creating new forms of subjectivity and social relations.
So they suggest that the body without organs, while dangerous, also holds the key to escaping capitalist control and embracing the creative potential of desire.
And they connect the body without organs to becoming animal, a deterritorialization process that involves breaking free from human identity limitations and embracing the fluidity of animal life.
This seems to challenge anthropocentrism, the idea of human centrality, replacing it with a more ecological and relational view of the world.
Becoming animal isn't about literally becoming an animal, but about opening oneself to the transformative potential of animal life, to the flows of desire that connect humans to nature.
They see this as resisting the striating forces of capitalism and the state, which try to confine and control both human and animal life.
Now, a key takeaway from their work is understanding how language functions as a tool of power. They argue that language isn't neutral, but shapes our perceptions, constructs identities, and reinforces power relations.
They introduce order words to emphasize that language isn't just about information, but about giving orders, shaping perceptions, and exerting control.
They argue that order words are embedded in social institutions and function to maintain those structures by interpellating individuals, assigning them specific roles and identities.
Examples like how teachers use language to discipline students or doctors use language to diagnose and treat patients illustrate this point.
And they link order words to their broader analysis of power, arguing that power operates not only through force or coercion, but through the subtle workings of language, shaping our understanding of the world and our place within it.
They also discuss faciality machines, which they see as a way of understanding how the face is produced as a social construct.
They argue that faciality machines create a standardized, recognizable face that regulates social interactions and reinforces power structures.
Examples like standardized passport photos or facial recognition technology for surveillance illustrate this concept.
And they connect faciality machines to their analysis of capitalism, arguing that capitalism, with its emphasis on individualism and standardized commodities, drives the production of the face as a social construct.
So the face isn't a natural feature of human identity, but a product of social and economic forces that control and regulate behavior.
One of their key insights is that desire isn't simply within the individual, but is produced through social and economic forces. They argue that desire is constantly being channeled and redirected by the dominant structures of society.
This channeling of desire becomes a key mechanism of social control, ensuring individuals conform to existing norms and power relations.
Capitalism, they argue, is particularly adept at capturing and channeling desire, directing it towards consuming commodities and pursuing profit.
Advertising, marketing, and consumer culture are key tools in this process. They create new desires and needs, funneling them towards the consumption of commodities.
And they connect this analysis of desire to their critique of psychoanalysis, arguing that psychoanalysis, with its focus on the Oedipus complex and the family, reinforces societal structures by framing desire as originating within the individual and directed towards the family.
So psychoanalysis, while claiming to offer liberation, actually contains and controls desire, preventing it from becoming a truly revolutionary force.
One of their most provocative concepts is becoming woman, which they see as a deterritorialization process that challenges traditional gender roles and embraces the fluidity of gender identity.
They clarify that becoming woman isn't about literally becoming a woman, but about challenging the binary opposition between male and female and embracing the potential for fluidity and transformation beyond those categories.
They see becoming woman as a line of flight, an escape from patriarchal society, and an embrace of a more fluid and liberating understanding of gender.
It's not just about individual transformation, but about creating new social and political possibilities, new ways of organizing society that move beyond traditional gender roles.
They connect becoming woman to their broader analysis of deterritorialization, arguing that it's not just about breaking down physical boundaries, but about challenging the mental and social structures that limit our potential for creativity and transformation.
Now, they also talk about the relationship between smooth space and striated space, and how these relate to the war machine and the state apparatus.
Smooth space, as they describe it, is fluid, open, and unconfined. It's the space of the nomad, the war machine. Striated space, on the other hand, is fixed, ordered, and controlled. It's the space of the state of sedentary societies.
And they argue that the state constantly tries to striate smooth space to impose its order and control. They use the example of how states build roads and walls to divide and control territory.
And they link this process of striation to the state's attempts to capture and subdue the war machine. They're suggesting that the war machine thrives in smooth space where it can move freely and evade capture.
Now, they also discuss how capitalism relates to smooth and striated space.
What's interesting here is how they see capitalism as a force that both deterritorializes and reterritorializes. They argue that capitalism in its early stages was a powerful force of deterritorialization, breaking down feudal structures and opening up new markets.
But they also argue that capitalism as it develops also creates new forms of striation, new ways of controlling and channeling desire. They point to how capitalism uses things like advertising and consumer culture to create new desires and needs, channeling them towards the consumption of commodity.
Exactly. They're suggesting that capitalism, while initially appearing to be a force of liberation, ultimately creates new forms of control and exploitation. And they see a connection between this process of capitalist reterritorialization and the state's efforts to striate smooth space. Now, in Anti-Oedipus, they draw a fascinating parallel between the functioning of desiring production and the structure of the factory. They argue that both involve processes of assemblage, breaking down materials into components, and then reassembling them into new products.
What's particularly intriguing is how they see desiring production as operating on multiple levels. It's not just about producing objects or satisfying basic needs. It's also about producing subjectivity, about constructing our sense of self and our place in the world.
And they suggest that capitalism, with its focus on production and consumption, taps into this process of desiring production, exploiting it for its own ends. They argue that capitalism constantly seeks to channel desire towards the consumption of commodities, creating a cycle of endless production and consumption that ultimately benefits the capitalist system.
Now, to understand how they see this process of desiring production, it's helpful to look at their concept of partial objects. They argue that desire doesn't operate on whole objects, but on fragments, bits and pieces that are constantly being assembled and reassembled.
They see these partial objects as charged with libidinal energy, and they suggest that desire flows between these partial objects, creating connections and circuits.
And they link this idea of partial objects to the structure of the factory, arguing that the factory, like desiring production, breaks down materials into component parts and then reassembles them into new products. They're suggesting that capitalism in its very structure mirrors the workings of desire, exploiting its fluidity and its capacity for assemblage.
And to grasp how this process of desiring production relates to subjectivity, we need to look at their concept of the body without organs. They describe this as a kind of virtual plane, a surface upon which desire operates, connecting and reconnecting partial objects.
They argue that the body without organs is not a physical thing, but a kind of abstract machine, a surface of inscription upon which desire writes itself. And they suggest that capitalism, in its efforts to channel and control desire, seeks to colonize this body without organs to impose its own order and structure upon the flows of desire.
And they link this process of colonization to the production of subjectivity, arguing that capitalism produces subjects who are fragmented, alienated, and perpetually caught in the cycle of production and consumption.
Now, in 1,000 Plateaus, they draw a distinction between two types of assemblages, machinic assemblages and collective assemblages of enunciation. They use these concepts to analyze how desire operates within different social formations.
They describe machinic assemblages as those that are primarily concerned with the production of material goods. They argue that these assemblages are characterized by their focus on efficiency, productivity, and the optimization of resources.
And they suggest that capitalism, with its emphasis on industrial production and the pursuit of profit, is a prime example of a machinic assemblage.
Now, they describe collective assemblages of enunciation as those that are primarily concerned with the production of meaning, with the creation of shared beliefs, values, and ideologies. They argue that these assemblages are characterized by their focus on communication, symbolism, and the construction of social reality.
And they suggest that religion, art, and political movements are examples of collective assemblages of enunciation.
Now, what's interesting is how they see these two types of assemblages as interconnected and interdependent. They argue that machinic assemblages produce the material conditions for the existence of collective assemblages of enunciation, while collective assemblages of enunciation provide the symbolic frameworks that give meaning and purpose to the activities of machinic assemblages.
They're suggesting that desire operates within both types of assemblages, and that understanding how these assemblages interact can help us understand how desire is channeled and controlled within society.
Now, to illustrate these concepts, they draw a distinction between two types of space, smooth space and striated space. They argue that smooth space is characterized by its fluidity, its openness to movement and connection. They see the nomad, the war machine, as embodying this smooth space.
And they argue that striated space, on the other hand, is characterized by its fixity, its division into bounded territories, and its regulation by rules and laws. They see the state with its emphasis on order and control as embodying this striated space.
Now, what's interesting is how they see these two types of space as constantly interacting and transforming each other. They argue that the state constantly seeks to striate smooth space to impose its order and control upon the fluidity of nomadic life.
But they also argue that the war machine constantly seeks to smooth striated space to break down boundaries and create new lines of flight.
They're suggesting that desire operates within both types of space, and that understanding how these spaces interact can help us understand how desire is channeled and controlled within society.
Now, they also use this distinction between smooth space and striated space to analyze the relationship between capitalism and the state. They argue that capitalism, with its emphasis on deterritorialization and the expansion of markets, initially appears to be a force for smoothing space.
But they also argue that capitalism, as it develops, also creates new forms of striation, new ways of controlling and channeling desire.
They point to examples like the way capitalism uses things like advertising and consumer culture to create new desires and needs, channeling them towards the consumption of commodities.
They're suggesting that capitalism, while initially appearing to be a force of liberation, ultimately creates new forms of control and enclosure. And they see a connection between this process of capitalist reterritorialization and the state's efforts to striate smooth space.
Now, in Anti-Oedipus, they highlight how capitalism continually deterritorializes and reterritorializes desire, a process they see as central to its functioning. They link this to schizophrenia, which they view as a limited experience of capitalism.
Right. And they suggest that understanding this connection can help us consider alternative ways of organizing society that allow for more freedom and creativity without falling into those traps of capitalist exploitation.
So ultimately, Deleuze and Guattari present us with a powerful and provocative analysis of desire, capitalism, and the potential for liberation. They challenge us to rethink our assumptions about the world, to question the structures that confine us, and to embrace the fluidity and multiplicity of becoming.
Their work offers a rich vocabulary and a conceptual framework for understanding the forces that shape our lives and for imagining new possibilities for the future.
It's a call to embrace the rhizome, to follow lines of flight, and to create new assemblages that foster freedom, creativity, and a more just and equitable world.
So as we conclude this deep dive, let's remember to keep those desiring machines running those lines of flight open and to continue exploring the vast and challenging landscape of Deleuze and Guattari's thought.
Thanks for joining us.